Playback and action. The interesting thing about Simulcam is that it integrated our Fusion camera system, which was for shooting 3D, with our virtual camera system. What Simulcam did was it put the two together. It overlaid a virtual capture environment on a live action set. It allows us to treat that Fusion 3D camera as if it's a virtual camera.
We would actually track these 3D cameras in space.
And we can feed into it the images of computer-generated environments and computer-generated characters at the same time.
The Simulcam essentially really is kind of a live green screen element. When you're normally filming against a green screen, you don't have the background in any of your monitors of what will finally be rendered on that green screen. But what the Simulcam allows you to do is to sort of interact with that environment that is going to be digitally built eventually. And so you can sort of sync those two things together on your monitor so you can interact between the two environments.
So much green around that you can lose sight of what we're doing. And you forget that you're actually making a movie where there's bigger than life amp suits and space shuttles. And to actually see that back on a monitor just gives me a little taste of what's around. So you're not just playing to green, and it just feeds your imagination more. It allows you to live in the world and not just always up here.
Wherever you'd point the lens, you'd see set extensions. Wherever there would be green, you'd see Pandora.
Let's say that I have a scene with humans interacting with an avatar, like when Jake and Norm wake up in the laboratory.
That's fine.
Okay, good. Just take it nice and slow.
We were in there literally with handheld cameras pointing at a blank gurney.
Are you feeling lightheaded or dizzy?
And there's Jake.
Are you wiggling your toes?
I can see Jake in my monitor as a computer-generated character in the live-action scene.
Sit down, Jake.
Listen to me.
It completely changes how you film these CG plates. Part of filmmaking is the composition. If you're just composing to nothing, you don't know where you're landing. Here, you can see it.
Eyes up. Check that overhead.
The cool part is we can show the actors exactly what it's going to look like.
They can truly interact.
You need to sit down.
I need you to sit down. Jake, it's okay. Buddy, listen to me. Just to the end. Jake, watch your camera. Jake.
Thanator is the king hell predator of Pandora. I visualized it in the writing as a six-legged, armored, panther-like creature.
You have like big teeth and this sort of muzzle that comes forward. And Jim had been very clear about certain aspect that he wanted, which is this fleshy kind of pads, right, that lie flat, except as a threat display, when it's about to attack, they flare out. Again, that all pretty much comes down to Jim and his sketches. You know? I think it went through some detailing passes, but pretty much that's his creature. One thing that he added to the design were these flaps on the sides of the mouth that sort of roll back as it's getting ready to bite your head off. Just brings you up another notch.
What about this one? Run, don't run, what?
Run, definitely run!
We were shooting these Thanator sequences, and we started with having Ruben, our stunt double for Sam, running from the Thanator and getting picked up by the Thanator and shaken like a rag doll and thrown on the ground. And I mean, these are just amazing stunts. I mean, just the energy, the force that was generated and that he was able to withstand. The way that Thanator flings him on the ground is pretty amazing. You know, the punishment that he took, you know, in the name of art. And then the Thanator was animated to match those movements, and then Weta sent that animation to us, and then I put the cameras on it. And that idea that we would not just be sending everything unidirectionally to Weta, but that we would send them something, they would send us something back, then we would send them more. It became kind of a feedback loop. But it got more sophisticated later, because when we were doing the big fight between Quaritch's amp suit and the Thanator at the end, we had to figure out how to choreograph this fight. And for me, I was all about trying to do things I could direct, that I could actually get involved in. So we decided to have Alicia, Vela Bailey, actually be the Thanator. Then later, we also captured Zoe as Neytiri, riding the Thanator. So here Zoe is essentially riding the motion of her own stunt double. It's all very bizarre, you know, how this works. But we put Zoe on this Thanator mock-up, which was really just this kind of thing that we grabbed, and myself and the stunt coordinator, Garrett, and a couple of the other stunt guys, we just grabbed this thing and we tried to shake it around like a bull at Gillies, see if we could throw her off. I don't think we ever threw her off.
The Thanator is a medley of a lot of different animals, you know, modified. And it has a leopard cry that's very much a signature. I remember reading the script and thinking, oh no, this guy's gotta be really badass. And at the same time, have a lot of components based in rage, but also sort of raging frustration.
The Thanator is like a great white shark is to a scuba diver. It's just death. When it comes after you, it does not stop. It just digs everything out of the way. When it's toned you up as a target, you're not gonna make it. Neville did a lot of the original drawings and came up with some of the gestural flow lines of the skull and of the wing shapes and so on.
What I was trying to do is, say, a great white shark, when you look at the tail of a great white shark, the lines on that are so, designed, and you can get away with some really interesting form language on these creatures by actually intentionally thinking about the flow of a particular bone line. And it really lent itself to some unique forms. It has to be able to fly, and not just fly like any bird, it has to be a stunt bird, because in the movie, of course, this thing isn't just kind of flapping along.
We had to make sure that the design allowed the creature to move the way it needed to move. It needed to take off from a hanging position, almost like a bat. It can land and take off from a limb or something that it can grip from below. You see all this different behavior from the Banshees, and very little of it is explained, if any. It all has to be just intuitively grasped by the audience. We came up with the idea that it would actually have 4 wings. Just as the creatures all have an additional limb, so they're 6-limbed, the Banshees actually have an additional wing. In fact, if you watch closely, when the Banshees are really trying to get power, like on a takeoff, or in a rapid climb, or when they're being pursued, say, by a Leonopteryx or by a gunship, they are using that aft wing, which we call the canard, for more power. And we had to figure out how does a 4-winged creature fly? What does it look like? How does that aft wing work in conjunction with the forward wing? And it turns out that it actually flaps just a tiny bit later, so that it forms like a power cycle. Stan Winston's guys under John Rosengrant came in and reworked the head a little bit to work on the architecture around the mouth. The Banshee's mouth is very complex. It has what's called the maxilla of a barracuda, which gives it the ability to open very, very wide. And it also has a kind of snake-like ability to rack its teeth forward. A venomous snake will move its fangs forward and back like this. Well, we took a whole row of teeth and racked them back. The purpose of that was not just to make it fierce when it opened its mouth. The purpose was so that it could have an almost beak-like look when we didn't want all those teeth, so that when Neytiri is, petting the head of Seze, her banshee, it seems more bird-like. And then later, when it opens its mouth and flares its teeth out in that big threat display, we see that the business end of this critter is really not something you want to mess with. The Banshee has these huge scythe-like claws, which are on an appendage that's called the alula. That's what it's called in a bird. It's very much like the finger of a fruit bat. The Banshee's alula, its claws, were used to hook onto cliffs, hook onto trees, and so on, and also presumably in an attack, that's what it would capture its prey with. And the alula also has a little steering vane on it, and when it goes into a steep dive, it folds its wings all the way back, pushes the alula out to the side, and uses those steering vanes to guide it in its dive when it's falling at terminal velocity. A lot of people were contributing to that design. Daphne Yap and Yuri Bartoli did the amazing patterns on the wings, the color maps and the textures and so on of the wings and the body that make the creature so vibrant and so spectacular. We wanted to constantly remind people that they were seeing something they'd never seen before. But we also wanted to always give them a familiarity. And let's give it this wild color palette. So we looked at the colors of poison dart frogs and tropical reef fish for the patterns on the wings.
I think the last big design hurdle was the Banshees coloring, where after the Banshees were done and Weta had them and they were rendering them, Jim had this idea for the color scheme. So I ended up going in and painting very, very high resolution renders of these Banshees. You know, like a digital camera takes 10 megapixels or 12 megapixels, but I was painting like 190 megapixel images. You know, it's like every little pore, every little fractal detail in there, which was something Jim was very specific. I has to work on all these levels because we get so close to it. I'd be in the middle of building a set for the virtual camera system, and then he would go, this Banshee's not working, I need some design on this. So I'd jump onto that horse and start painting furiously and trying to figure out the color scheme, and Jim would come up, no, make it more blue. No, it's too blue, make it more green. Okay, put some yellow stripes in there, that looks cool. So again, these are all his creatures, ultimately, you know.
Jim would often say, it's an alien planet, so anything goes. And these creatures are extremely colorful, very bright. It's just one of the things that I think is going to separate the creatures from a lot of creature done in the past.
It's really interesting because people have talked a lot about the Na'vi language and what it took to build the Na'vi language. They never talked about the Banshee language, but there is a Banshee language. It makes all kinds of different sounds, and those sounds mean different things. There's the distant call, and then there's a kind of a greeting cry, and then there's a threat display, a roar, and there's a threat hiss, and they have different levels of aggression. And then there's a kind of little squeaky shriek that it makes when it's stressed and it submits away from an encounter.
Cry itself was the hardest part. I experimented with a tremendous amount of large raptors, birds, as well as a lot of baby creatures, baby cougars, baby swine, baby cubs of various different natures. And I just started building a palette of calls and sent them down to Jim, and he started picking some of the ones that he liked. So he really built a path for us to follow.
Our movement coach, Terry Notary, performed some of our creature movements. When we were filming flight paths of the Banshee and we had our little maquette puppets that we were capturing, Terry actually flapped his arms as he was the wings of the Banshee.
As we worked our way through all these problems of virtual production, we really found that flying the Banshee was the hardest problem. We just kept coming back to it, and we never really cracked it. We started off thinking that, well, when you want to bank the Banshee, you lean into it the way you would on a motorcycle. That turned out to be completely wrong, because if the Banshee banks that far and you bank even farther, you're going to fall right off head first. So it turned out that we had to do the opposite. As the Banshee banked left, the rider had to shift their weight to the right to maintain a center of gravity. So it turned out to be the team to do all those moves. Then the rider would have been just along for the ride. They would have always been reacting later to what the Banshee was doing. But these people are supposed to be riding and directing the Banshee with the power of their mind. So they needed to move together. They needed to move in this perfect flow, or even initiate the move. And so that's what you see. And then we've had to figure out how to do it all in sync with the flight path we had created. We created these flight paths, had all the bank maneuvers in them based on the terrain and the timing of the shot. So now we had to have the actors banking in time with the flight paths.
Bang, level, flare, flap, 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 jump.
And again, that was done manually, so it had this really organic quality. And I think it's just stunning the way Zoe looks riding her Banshee and the way Sam looks riding his Banshee. They just look so perfectly attuned to those animals. There's a perfectly good rationale for why the military technology on Pandora looks so almost 21st century. The idea was always to figure out how to make it feel familiar and yet futuristic at the same time. And that blend of familiarity and futuristic hardware is in the helicopters as well, you know. You've got the Scorpion gunship, you've got the Samson gunship, which is a heavy lifter, and then you got the big Juggernaut gunship, which is the Dragon, which is almost like a mini flying aircraft carrier.
One of the vehicles that took the longest to actually get from, you know, a scribble on a notepad to something in 3D was the Samson, you know, a troop carrying kind of helicopter-like vehicle with twin rotors. In the process of developing it, you know, we had to go through and really evaluate, like, what would these surfaces do, how would these rotors work, and Jim knew all about how he wanted the tilt rotors to operate. We had that all figured out according to his understanding of the technology.
So Steve Ingram and his team of effects wizards, you know, the practical effects guys down in New Zealand, built this Samson mock-up, and it was amazing. It was actually fun to fly around in that thing. It felt like a real helicopter. You know, I told him to be as truthful to real helicopter controls as he could be. He actually got real helicopter controls and put them in. And as a helicopter pilot, it was great to sit in that cockpit and just work the collective and the cyclic and see the pedals working properly and all that. You felt like you could fly that thing. You felt like it could just take off. Of course, it didn't have all its rotor system and all that. We added that all in CG later. But they had to work out how they were going to fly this thing, how they were going to land it with a crane, how they were going to do it safely, how they were going to put 10 people in it and fly it safely and land it safely.
And we got it all to a point where this kind of suite package existed, which was a plan, a 3D model, and the sets, and the seats, and the canopies, and the cockpits, and we handed that over to a consultant who was a future aviations expert. And he just said, I think you should take them out and fly them. Well, it looks like it worked to me, so we felt pretty good that we'd gotten in that sweet spot where it had that believability factor pretty high. One of our small attack vehicles. It's called the Scorpion. You know, Jim came up with that name, of course, which is an angry, fighting little insect. And in the course of this film, this thing is a deadly force to reckon with. You know, it represents the tip of the spear, so to speak, of the humans getting in there and messing with the local population. And so you want to build that into your design. You want this thing to look aggressive and arrogant and powerful. The speed at which they all proceed and the way in which this battle unfolds will be identifiable as more like the Vietnam era type of war attack sequences.
Jake, you copy? We're falling back! We're getting hammered!
When you get into the Dragon, you're really getting into the territory of the fantastic. And Jim always referred to it as a fantasy vehicle, in that it's supposed to have a signature to it that is really memorable, and it's going to have its own kind of iconic feel to it. So the design kind of grew out of a quick sketch that Jim had provided me, which was basically the idea of a poster bed arrangement of large fans, these big rotors. So the whole idea was that it has this muscularity. Jim always talked about it as being a super muscular vehicle, which is kind of based on the Osprey, which, again, it feels very real, it feels very believable to the audience, but it pushes beyond just the day-to-day normal kind of technology, and then it's got these wild shapes and these multiple flight compartments. This kind of helps pull it all together and make it seem real, although it is pretty fantastic.
The Dragon, we sort of decided that that was too big to actually move in any way. It didn't fly around on cables, but it had to look very real. So they did a tremendous amount of research looking at the details of the interiors of the V-22 Osprey and various other aircraft. And the inside of this thing is so perfectly detailed that you believe that it's a real aircraft. And I think the finish work that the New Zealand set builders did is just incredible on this movie. I've never been in sets this good. I think I might have scared them a little bit and said, look, we're coming with our 3D high-definition cameras and there's no place to hide. Everything has to look real. But they stepped up to that challenge, and I think everything does look real.
When you're approaching things, even inanimate objects, oftentimes you'll find if you listen carefully to what the director's saying, or if you just think about it in terms of the story, they do have to have a narrative quality to them. And so you want to build that into your design. You want this thing to look just powerful. And so you do bring the emotional ideas into the process, and you, through the skills that you've developed and your understanding of forms and other technologies, you try to eke your own little kind of poem, if you will, of technology or shapes that read whatever the story component is, and that's what you hope to get on screen.
I was one of the very first people hired on Avatar, and I was primarily tasked with creating sculptural maquettes of the bodies of the main Na'vi to create the physicality, the actual bodies and anatomies and proportions of each character.
I think we got inspired by Jordu that sculpting was still a very valid way for us to imagine these creatures and characters. And of course, the Stan Winston guys had always used clay sculpts, and they did every single character. Jake's avatar and Neytiri and all of the other Na'vi characters and so on were all created in clay before they went into 3D CG characters.
It's drawings first, then clay maquettes, just simple clay sculptures, and they can be really, really rough. It's, again, you're trying to capture the broad strokes, the volumes first, and then from there you can start to do your surface detailing. figuring out what the wrinkles are. Is it got a soft skin or kind of a hard hide? And all of those are part of the packaging process.
One of the things I think Jim was very, very specific about is that he did not want it to look like something that had been done before, which of course for a designer is thrilling and also kind of daunting, because you can't help but want to emulate to some extent things that have worked in the past. Very early on, one of the earliest drawings that was done for the film was one that Jim did of Neytiri. It still is my favorite piece of artwork that was done in the show. I thought it captured something that was just right. It was just her features sort of floating on a kind of grayish-brown background. I really, really got a good idea of what he was after and the kind of feel that he wanted. But one of the most important things about the maquette is not that you're just showing the design. What the maquette allows us to do, it gives it the human touch, and it also imbues the character with a sense of character that cannot be stressed enough. You get a sense of attitude. The amount of character that you can get in clay, as far as I see right now, is still superior to what you can get in just a digital rotatable model.
The clay is just so intuitive. You can grab it, you can turn it, you can look at it, you can light it, you can make little changes right there in the moment.
After our first pass at this, Jim started to see positive things that he liked. It was starting to look like a race of people. Then as we got the actors, it kind of fell into place that we would incorporate the actor into the design.
The other purpose that a maquette has is a scannable reference. Let's say this character named Neytiri, she was taken to a company called Gentle Giant that does 3D scanning, and they, with a laser, scanned every aspect of this sculpture. That is then transferred into a digital model, which can then be cleaned up and used for the actual film. Basically, I was trying to capture her fierceness, I was trying to capture her definite sense of physicality, and the movement of her as she steps off of a rock here with her spear. And this is a very accurate rendition of the length of her queue here. This show was very challenging. It was a great deal of fun, though, for me. I think the most exciting part was being pushed by someone who wants the best out of you and who's determined to get it because he knows you can do it.
Well, this is the AMP suit. Basically, in a nutshell, is an amplifier of a human operator. It's, super hydraulics are all very strong, so they can crush buildings and do all the things that like a tank would do.
The AMP is an acronym for Amplified Mobility Platform.
In this particular instance, the AMP suit itself is more like a vehicle. The operator stands in his canopy and is in an interface that takes his movement and translates them to the outside limbs, so that when the operator moves its hands, like let's say 10 inches, the machine might move it 20 feet. This notion of a human operator inside of a big war machine that actually functions like a human is something that Jim had from the very first moment that we talked.
I'm an unrequited engineer. I worked with Ty very closely to make sure that the AMP suit's shoulder motion would work and was thought out in terms of the various articulations, and the range of motion was all thought through, and where the power supplies would go, where the servos would go, and all that.
Of all the designs that I've been involved with, this was the most complex and definitely the most demanding. And this is the end result of a long period of time. And you can get a sense of the scale here. This is a 1-foot cube. So this is a 13-foot tall vehicle. And again, this one I think more, you can see that the canopy is very much like a traditional helicopter canopy. And then the suit itself is very kind of simplistic in the sense that it doesn't have a lot of artifice and not a lot of extra parts in that whole Japanese anime kind of way, but very much like construction, heavy military, just badass ass-kicking kind of machine technology.
Charlie 2-1, watch your spacing.
Eyes up, check that overhead. Everything about this machine works properly. There's no cheats here. It's not going to be one of those magical machines that's going to do things and you're going to go, well, I guess it could. These shoulders work properly. These are all figured out so that these radiuses work, and it duplicates all the motion of a normal human being.
As we got into the production and actually needed to physically build some of the things, we realized that Stan Winston Studios was perfectly suited to build things like the amp suit. And they went and they manufactured the amp suit. Not an easy piece to figure. There was engineering behind it. It had to stand up. It had to work out there on the physical set. We had to be able to take off the cockpit and put it on a motion base and operate it that way. We had to be able to take off the canopy. The canopy had to be able to open and close. And they did all this, and they handed me a guide to parts of the amp suit. And it was like a modeler's kit guide that they gave. And it was how to assemble an amp suit.
I kind of call it an Apache helicopter with legs. The soldiers use these things for both work purposes and going on patrol. There's a neat interface going on.
All right, ladies, let's bring the pain.
We've been recording guns for years now, and we recorded a lot of new ones for this film. And Jim is very adamant that they sound appropriate to what they're firing, and so the amp suit has to sound like the most massive cannon you ever heard.
Light 'em up!
Such an important part of Stephen Lang's character, Quaritch, was the amp suit. Just as the riders on the Banshees were perfectly attuned to their mounts, to their creatures, Quaritch is perfectly attuned to his amp suit. He's driven that thing for so long. He's so dexterous. You see that he moves and it moves in perfect harmony. The amp suit was an extension of Colonel Quaritch. He is a warrior. He is an amp suit samurai. He can do things with that suit that probably none of his other troopers can do. That makes him a very formidable enemy at the end. And when Neytiri leaps on him with the Thanator, you think, it's all over, buddy. You are going down. And I think the audience is surprised when that doesn't happen, and he turns the table.
Come on, come to Papa.
Hi there. Did you know that convicted felon O.J. Simpson was actually considered for the lead role in The Terminator? Director James Cameron rejected the choice at the time because he didn't think the, quote, likable, goofy, kind of innocent guy could pull off a cyborg assassin. If only he knew. Remember to click below to subscribe or on the side for more great content.